No guerrilla movement in Balochistan, and this is the fifth one, has been suppressed in that sense. The first one, Agha Abdul Karim's rebellion, was a small one, and they were tricked into coming down from the mountains on oath on the Holy Quran, ostensibly for negotiations, and then picked up and bumped into jail. The second one, which began in Sarawan in 1958, when Ayub carried out his military coup, was also suppressed not by military means but by trickery. Nauroz Khan and his colleagues were invited down again on oath on the Holy Quran for negotiations and arrested on their arrival. And then 9 of his sons and nephews were hanged. The 62-63 uprising that began in the Murray area was never defeated militarily, nor did they fall for any tricks. When Ayub was overthrown by the 68-69 countrywide agitation and the Yahya regime followed, his governor in West Pakistan, Air Marshal retired Noor Khan, negotiated a ceasefire and a kind of standstill agreement with the guerrillas so that the army withdrew from those areas, they were allowed to retain their weapons, and there was a kind of standstill. So you can't say that they were suppressed. In fact, I would argue that guerrilla movement or that guerrilla army was still relatively intact when the fourth insurgency in the 70s started. Even that ended in a compromise. It didn't end in a suppression. It ended in a stalemate, a military stalemate and a political stalemate. And when Bhutto was overthrown, then General Ziaul Haq, for his own expedient reasons, decided to make peace with the Baloch. So I don't think suppressed by military means quite describes the situation over the years. This one is, of course, the fifth one and continuing, so we can't talk about the end of this just yet. But you can see the pattern. The pattern is that the state is very powerful, its military is very powerful, and the guerrillas were unable to prevail over it, but equally the military was not able to prevail over the guerrillas by military means. So the situation has been a cycle of war and then compromise. I don't know how this one is going to end. I don't have a crystal ball. But the pattern certainly suggests that there isn't going to be a victory by either side. So sooner or later, the pressure for some kind of political settlement may gather pace. So we have to wait and see. Not for a minute. Let me share this with you. When we decided to come back to Pakistan, students and workers, Pakistanis, studying or working in Britain, it was with the conviction and commitment. It was a do-or-die effort. There was never any question of pulling out. We started with the idea of a revolution throughout Pakistan, saw Balochistan as an entry point, not as an end goal. And even during that movement, and despite great difficulties and very grievous problems and crises from time to time, as such movements tend to have, I don't think there was ever a moment when I or my colleagues thought, okay, throw in the towel. No, not at all. The solution that presents itself reasonably, and short of the breakaway of Balochistan, a separate state, independence and so on, is for the state of Pakistan to understand what are the genuine grievances of the Baloch throughout Pakistan's history. Most of them are doable, or they can be addressed within the ambit of the Federation and the Constitution. They are not unconstitutional demands, with the exception of separatism, okay? Because the Constitution doesn't allow that. But short of that, issues like control over their natural resources, rights in terms of employment, education, health, all the other issues, and then allowing Balochistan to find its own path to modernity through a democratic process rather than having it imposed from the outside or from on top. These are not issues that can't be resolved within the framework of the Constitution. It requires the political understanding, vision and will on the part of the central authorities. and particularly the military, because it has been, unfortunately, in the forefront of whatever military campaigns and whatever suppression has been taking place in Balochistan over the decades. So I think a change in mindset, both on the political side as well as on the military and security forces side. Take the situation for the moment. 20,000 election threw up a moderate nationalist government led by the National Party. It has no power. The security policy or the counterinsurgency policy is not under its control. The Chief Minister, Dr. Abdul Malik Baloch, has confessed as much publicly time and again. He has no power over it. The policy is being run by the military in the background or behind the curtain. The implementing agency is the Frontier Corps, which is a paramilitary force officered by regular officers of the Pakistan Army who are sent on secondment to that force. The original mandate of the force is control of borders, prevent smuggling, prevent illegal immigrants and that kind of thing. And strictly speaking, within that mandate, there is a limit beyond which they are not supposed to operate. They're basically supposed to operate along the border areas. But in a sort of stretch of that mandate, it has been deployed in the interior of Balochistan since this insurgency began and has been in the forefront of that policy. Unfortunately, it has also done things and outsourced things that have only inflamed the situation and aggravated the anger and alienation of the Baloch. I refer, of course, to this issue of disappearance of people. The FC was being blamed originally for this. They were denying it left, right and center, and then subsequently they outsourced it to death squads, militias that are mercenary and that disappear people or perhaps even kill them, and the FC then has plausible deniability. This is not a policy that is going to bring about a solution. The only solution possible for Balochistan is a political solution, and that means political vision, political will, and a change of the mindset. And we have to stop ascribing everything that goes wrong in Pakistan to India. This India obsession, I think it's a blinker. We need to open our eyes. India wasn't there in 1948, it wasn't there in 58, it wasn't there in 62, 63, it wasn't there in 73, and more than likely it's not there now because there's no evidence being produced to substantiate the claim that it's India that's supporting this movement. India has now also been blamed for supporting the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. So if everything is going to be lumped into India's basket, the risk is that actually you're not approaching the real problem and not finding the real solutions. And in a sense, you found a scapegoat in India. This is the traditional scapegoat. But what does that do to the way you conduct your policy then? In the name of Indian support, you start suppressing your own people. Actually, you're creating the conditions for someone or the other to get interested. If your house is on fire or if your waters are troubled, plenty of people willing to fish perhaps. So it needs a rethink. I think there is a solution available. Most of the demands are doable within the framework of the Federation and Constitution, but it requires the political will to do it. The necessity may recede. If you can satisfy the demands and grievances of the Baloch within the framework of the Federation and Constitution, there may not be such a strong argument for separatism. Let me discuss separatism with you in today's world. Okay? It's not a popular notion. It's very interesting to note that on the one hand, globalization is eroding the power and sovereignty of the nation state. We know that transnational corporations and multinational corporations and big business, global big business, is able to, in a way, make frontiers and borders porous, and go through them. But this is one tendency in today's world. On the other hand, there is the tendency that, if there are movements that are dissatisfied and want to break away from states, the consensus worldwide is not in favor. And so, in a sense, the Baloch movement or any other such separatist movement really is up against it. I'll give you examples. The Tamils wanted an independent state in Sri Lanka. Nobody was willing to support them. And eventually they were defeated militarily. The Kurds have been asking for an independent state either in the particular states in which they are scattered. They are in 4 states, Iraq, Iran, Turkey and Syria, or a greater Kurdistan. Nobody is willing to come forward. They're willing to support the Kurds against IS. They're willing perhaps to support the Kurds in the fight against Bashar al-Assad in Syria, but they're not willing to give the Kurds independent states or a greater state. So I think if you look at the run of consensus in the world today, separatist movements are, they're fighting an uphill battle. In the formative years of my coming to radical ideas, revolutionary ideas, I need to mention one particular experience which I think left an indelible mark on me. And that was the May 1968 protests in Paris, which began with students and then, began to become broader, and even the working class got involved. And this was against de Gaulle, who was in power at that time. Now, the thinking and slogans that emerged from that movement were very radical. I think they had shades in them of what was happening in China in the Cultural Revolution, the right to rebel and all that. And certainly they were attacking the consensus which seemed to exist in countries like France or Western Europe or the European Union, that, this is the model for the future liberal democracy, capitalism, all the rest of it. So they were attacking this basis. And in the process, what they did in Paris was they took over the Sorbonne, the university, and they also took over the Ajoka Theater. And these were then the 2 main locations where every evening, every night, meetings were held to debate and formulate strategy and what have you. I was sharing a flat with some friends, with a friend, I should say. Unfortunately, he's passed away. And one Sunday morning, we were sitting at home and reading the papers, reading about Paris. And the 2 of us looked at each other and said, this is something we've got to see. So we were students, we didn't have much money. So we got on a ferry and hopped across to Paris. And had nowhere to stay. So we went straight to the Sorbonne and the Odeon Theatre and attended the meetings. And I had the temerity to get up in the middle of the meeting and say, we are Pakistani students studying in London, and we have come here in solidarity to express our solidarity with the movement. So, it was greatly appreciated. Of course, I was speaking for myself. I wasn't speaking for anybody. But that never stopped me. No, it was a very interesting experience because you saw street battles in Paris that probably were reminiscent in a modern context of what happened in the 19th century in Paris when there were revolutionary movements. You heard of the Paris Commune, okay? And one of the consequences of the Paris Commune was the people of Paris who were fighting set up barricades. And they were, in those days, narrow, twisting streets and alleys. So if you put up a barricade, it became very difficult for the soldiers or the police to break through. They came under withering fire and they suffered the consequences. So after the Commune was suppressed, the Paris authorities decided to take measures to change this. So they did 2 things. First, they demolished buildings and opened up the streets and made them grand avenues. Okay? Wide open grand avenues. So barricades couldn't so easily hold out against the police and security and so on. And the second thing is they cobbled all the streets to ensure that, no brick or any such material was available for throwing by the protesters. But lo and behold, in May 68, when the students and workers started protesting and clashed with the very formidable CS police, which was the riot police in France, deadly looking. They look like stormtroopers out of Star Wars, before Star Wars, in black and with black shields and visors and masks and what have you, really formidable. So what the protesters did was they dug up the cobblestones of the Paris streets and threw them at the police. I saw that with my own eyes. Of course, tear gas and baton charges and what have you. No weapons, mind. I mean, apart from these kind of weapons, no firearms is what I'm trying to say. But certainly it was a battle that I was privileged to watch as a participant and very much there. And I came back greatly inspired by that, because it seemed to me that young people in 1968 were challenging the established order and trying to formulate a very different world from the one they'd inherited from their parents. Well, I think I mentioned earlier that I went to do accountancy and I found it extremely boring, and I eventually gave it up after finishing my studies. It's not a profession I wanted to pursue, I discovered midway. And when I got really browned off with it, my old interest in theatre and acting was somehow rekindled. You know, I'd been in plays in school and college and what have you, and I had an interest, certainly. And at that point, I cast around and discovered that, you know, Britain generally and London in particular, they have a wonderful program of evening classes. And this is continuing adult education, okay? And it's paid for, it's subsidized, it's very cheap, you know, anybody can afford it. And so I took up in the local council, I think it was at that point Swiss Cottage I was living in, that's right, Swiss Cottage. So there were classes in theatre and acting, and I joined. And what did I discover? The teacher, a woman, must have been in her 60s at that time, she had been a member of Bertolt Brecht's ensemble in Berlin, which was a very avant-garde and very creative and experimental theatre group. The whole Brechtian technique in theatre comes from there, which is, you know, he uses what has been dubbed in the literature the alienation effect, i.e. what he's trying to do is not follow Aristotle, who wanted emotion, joy and sorrow, to emanate from the stage and grip the audience. Instead of emotion, Brecht is appealing to intelligence. So it's a very different approach to theatre and a very different purpose for theatre, perhaps. So she was coming from that background. And it's not that she tried to impose those techniques on us. No, she led us through the traditional techniques. And at the risk of some immodesty, I have to report that she had 2 star pupils in her group in my class. One was an English girl called Liz, who went on to, in fact, an acting career. I lost touch with her. I don't know what happened to her after that. And the other was myself. And although she had a lot of confidence in my ability, in my talent, she did say to me at some stage that, you know, you're probably not good enough, good looking enough to play lead roles, you know. Looks are important for that, even in theatre. But I think you're a very intelligent person, and I think you'll make a brilliant director, should you go down that path. I did those classes, I think, for almost 2 years. And the purpose of taking these classes was, she was preparing us to audition for one of the major drama schools. And there were 3 in London at that time. One was RADA, the Royal Academy, one was Central Academy, and the third was Lambda. So getting into any of these 3 through an audition for which you had to prepare meant, you know, you were embarked on that path, because any product of these academies was almost guaranteed a career, at least on stage, and then of course further television, film, whatever the case may be. The reason why even today film industries like Hollywood are so enamored of British actors is because they come through this mill. They are trained, they go through the mill. You know, they do repertory theatre. You know what repertory theatre is? Repertory theatre are companies that do a series of plays as a regular program. They do them cyclically during the week. So if you were to go to that theatre, you might see 3 performances of different plays on one day, different timings. And the same company is doing them. So can you imagine the amount of experience you gain and the amount of, creative space that you create by going through that mill? It's tough, but it's very good training. And similarly, their academies are excellent. I mean, anybody who comes out of that academy is off and running, so to speak. So we were preparing for that. Unfortunately, other things intervened. By 1968, I was, as I said, becoming radicalized, and then I just dropped out. So after I dropped out, I became radical. I was involved in revolutionary activity, and that led me through the anti-Vietnam War campaign in 1968 to Pakistan and eventually Balochistan.
Did you bring theatre back?
Now I have to now tell you about that. After the Balochistan struggle was over and I came back from underground in 1979, I hadn't really contemplated theatre as an activity. I mean, it had been many years and I'd left it behind. It was not something I was now interested in pursuing as a career or anything. In any case, I was back in Pakistan. But some interesting things happened. One thing that happened was that Ziaul Haq's dictatorship was in power. I came back in March 1979 from underground. Within a month, in April, I think it was April the 4th, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was hanged. So suddenly the whole political scenario changed. Now we had been in the forefront of opposition to Bhutto and his repression of the Baloch. But it was not a personal thing, it was political. And to see him suffer this fate at the hands of a military dictatorship was unacceptable. And I remember in the aftermath of that hanging, being involved in discussions with PPP people. And quite frank and open and above board in saying, look, I'm so and so. They knew who I was. And this is what I've been doing. They knew that too. And I explained, that it was not personal, it was political, and what has happened to Mr. Bhutto, we condemn as much as you do. So we stand by you in solidarity against this military dictatorship, what it has done. And I think those are the discussions which by the time the 1983 MRD movement arrived, I was very much on the streets with them, being gassed and bait on charge and all the rest of it, And some of those are lifelong friendships now. People's Party people appreciated the fact that here was somebody who fought against Mr. Bhutto, but on a question of principle was standing with them when they became the underdogs. So some lifelong friendships as a result. Now, what happened in the 83 movement was that by and large it was suppressed ferociously by the Zia regime. I remember demonstrations on the Mall and on the side streets of the Mall going all the way up to the railway station, and a lot of tear gas, a lot of lathi charge, and we witnessed commandos, either police or military commandos. We never found out because they were in plain clothes, but these guys were so well trained that I remember at the Regal Chalk, which was always the staging point of any central point of any demonstration in those days, I remember an incident where there were people, where the Regal Cinema is, above it, on the right, there was a building, and some people were up there and shouting slogans and unfurling banners from there. And I'm an eyewitness to the fact, this commando, he climbed up the face of the building and nabbed them up there. We saw this kind of thing. And then, of course, I was witness to people courting arrest. The day Salman Taseer courted arrest at Regal Chalk, I was within 3 feet of him when he was arrested, and of course then tortured in the Lahore fort, and went through all that. People were underground before the MRD movement, they came out above ground, including Begum Nusrat Bhutto, they came out for the MRD movement, a lot of them were arrested, and a lot of them suffered torture and what have you. So it was brutally suppressed, and the only exception, or rather the last holdout, was Sindh, where of course the People's Party had more support. But what happened there was that once the movement of protest had been suppressed brutally, many of the protesters in Sindh retreated into the countryside and tried to wage guerrilla warfare. Of course, they had not prepared for it. If they had consulted me, I would have told them that. And so it was a spontaneous response or reaction to the suppression. Very soon they found that it's not so simple to wage a guerrilla war. You need logistics, you need organization, you need finance, you need all those things. And since they had not prepared any of that, very soon they degenerated into roving bands of bandits who are called dhadel in Sindhi. So they became dhadel. So the politics of it fell away and it just became a criminal activity. And that, eventually kind of disappeared, slowly. A pall of gloom and darkness fell on Pakistan as a result of the suppression of that movement. That movement involved all the political parties, not just the People's Party. There was a united front, and the MRD was the platform from which they all struggled. With the suppression of that movement, Zia seemed to be master of all he surveyed, and there was no squeak of dissent from the entire country. The silence of the graveyard descended. For people like myself, it was a moment, and I'm sure others, a moment of reflection as to what now is the way forward against the Zia dictatorship. And in 1984, quite by chance, an opportunity of sorts presented itself. My friend Salman Shahid, who's now a famous actor, wasn't then, approached me one day that we are thinking of doing a theatre workshop. And would you join us? I said, of course. I wasn't doing anything else. And my interest was rekindled in theatre since nothing else was going on. So I went along to their first meeting and I met Madiha Gauhar and I met Sarmad Sehwai, who was very much part of this to begin with. And after we had done, I have to go back and tell you that in these acting classes that I took in London, they taught you improvisation. Now what is improvisation? Improvisation is you don't have a script, you don't have characters, you create the characters and ad-lib the dialogue in character while you're on stage. That is for training purposes because it does two things. A, it teaches you how to get into character and remain in character and how to relate that character to the relationships of the actors around you, the characters that they are playing. And it also teaches you presence of mind, which is very important because if you forget your lines on stage, which does happen even to the best actors, and despite prompting, you've got to have the presence of mind to be able to carry that over. So we did an improvisation theatre workshop to begin with in Ajoka. And for some reason they thought I was good. So they said, all right, let's do something. So what we did was, the first play that we did was called Jaloos. It was by an Indian playwright called Badal Sarkar. It was a street play. Now street theatre, I don't know if you know, is very different from proscenium theatre, stage, formal, this, that. It is essentially an agitation tool. It's a tool where you don't have a formal theatre, hall, and all the other things that go with it. You're out on the street, out in a community, and you're putting on a performance, and you're expecting and hoping for the participation of the audience around you. I.e. they relate to it and get involved with it. So this was a street theatre play, Jaloos. Jaloos means processions, okay? Now obviously it was based in India. The playwright is a Bengali, and Bengal, is the hotbed of agitation and political movements, till now even, and certainly at that time. And so what we did was, we, through our improvisation workshops, adapted the play to Pakistan. And so we obviously, whereas the original script was targeting obvious targets in India, politicians, others, we adapted it not only to target politicians or politics, generals, the mullah, and all the characteristic forces that were with and behind the Zia regime and which had really got us in a vice-like grip as a society. hasn't eased. They still got us in that grip, by the way. So we did this play, Jalous. We couldn't find a hall to do it in. And so we used Madiha Gauhar's mother's back lawn. And we did it in the round. The round means that the actors and the action is in the middle and the audience is sitting all around. So you enter through the crowd, exit through the crowd and do your stuff there. And it was quite amazing what happened. And I'll explain why later. First I'll tell you what happened. There was no television in those days except for PTV. There was no radio except for Pakistan radio. The only alternative media, if there was any, were newspapers. And of those, Pakistan Times, which had once been Mia Iftikhar's left-wing paper group, had been taken over by Ayub Khan and was now a state-run media group, so you could not hope for anything from there. And the other major group, of course, an English group, was Dawn, and the rest was Urdu. Now we had friends in the press. Some we had made before, some during the 83 movement, so we were able to mobilize the press to give us coverage. Now they arrived. We had an audience on any given night, I think we did it for a week or so, of between 150 to 200 people. That's all you could accommodate there. I suspect many of them were intelligence agents checking up on what we were up to. You could tell from their haircuts. But the press arrived en masse. And not only arrived, they went gaga. No. They gave such a splash to this. It was in all the papers, and suddenly we had arrived. And that is the beginning of the street theatre and alternative theatre movement of Pakistan's modern history. And I'm happy to say that I had some part to play in it. After Jalous, we did another play for which we actually constructed a stage. And that was called Panjwa Chirag. And it's written by Sarmad Sahbai. It's in Punjabi. And it explores the culture of shrines, peers, murids, and all the evil things that go on alongside, So it was a very interesting, resonant kind of production. And that went down again very well. Of course, then the inevitable happened. Fight, split, I left, Because look, I wasn't at a stage in my life where I was going to get involved at a level where people were jealous of me or, wanted to do me down and give themselves prominence. I'm not taking any names. So I said, look, this is ridiculous, this is immature and ridiculous, and I don't have time for this. So I left. Subsequently, there were further fights and further splits, and some of those groups that split from Ajoka came to see me. I remember I was at the Nation then. And they said to me, we are quite pissed off and unhappy with the way we've been treated, and we want to take on the movers and shakers of Ajoka and grind them into the dust. I advised against it. I said, look, the problem is that it's a very small activity, despite the splash it's created, all the other things, ripples that it's created. And everyone will turn around and point to us and say, this is the problem with the left in Pakistan. They cannot work together. They come together and they split. And this is their inevitable trajectory. So why should we, reinforce that view, perception of us? I think there's so much work to be done that no end of groups can do it. Any number of groups can be doing it. So instead of attacking each other and trying to grind each other into the dust, why don't you go off and do your own thing? So other groups emerged from Ajoka. Sanj was one, Lok Rehes was the other. These are all groups whose mother group was Ajoka. And they've all, not all of them survived. I think Lok Rehes has. And they're doing their thing. And they're making a contribution, raising the political issues and other issues that afflict our society through art. Now, this is not something that I entered into with a well thought out conceptual framework. It just happened. It was spontaneous. But having gone through that experience, I then began to study similar experiences elsewhere, and particularly South Africa. It had the most draconian apartheid regime, repressive to the core. You couldn't raise your head. So political struggle was so difficult in those circumstances, despite the ANC and other parties like PAC struggling against it. So what they did was, they found other avenues for struggle. And this now I could relate to, having been through this experience. Sport, football clubs especially, which gathered children from the slums, Soweto and other places, and in the guise of football clubs, they were actually conducting politics, gathering people and conducting politics. And culture. And what did that mean? Music, street theatre, and all these other things. And that too, you see, in a situation of such repression, it was very important to keep the movement going. The leaders were all in prison. Mandela had been served 27 years in prison, and most of them served similar terms. So the leadership was in, and the movement had to be sustained and keep its morale up. And one of the ways to do it, when politics was impossible, open politics was impossible, one of the ways to do it was to find alternative conduits for putting the message out and for creating solidarity and for keeping the mobilization going. And sports and culture, I'm trying to suggest, were very important components of the South African struggle against apartheid. Now, I latched onto that, and I thought this was an excellent idea, and actually in practice that is what had happened vis-a-vis Ajoka. Because I explained the pall of gloom and darkness that had descended after the 83 movement was suppressed. And this is 84, barely a year later. So you can see what I'm driving at. And just as an aside, let me mention to you that in conversation with my son, Taimur Rahman, one day, who got involved in politics in Pakistan, Communist Mazdoor Kisan Party, he's the Secretary General now. And I was saying to him, I said, we have got to revisit the way the left has been doing politics, generally and in Pakistan in particular. I said it's a very cut and dried method, study groups, going out to particular groups in society, working class, middle class, student, this, that, intelligentsia, etc. And conducting discussions and a very sort of almost cliched by now approach. Something fresh, something creative, something different may be required, because inspiration was trickling into the drain holes. Why was it? Because the world over revolution was receding, and it culminated in the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of socialism in Eastern Europe, and in the minds of many in the West, the collapse of the whole revolutionary project. So some spark was required. So I suggested to him that culture was perhaps the route to take. And I'm not claiming any credit for it, but I think I planted some seed, and Lal is the result of that seed. The Lal Band is the result of that seed. He went away to study, and there he was always interested in music. Then he actually took music formally as a subject, learnt it, and the rest is history. What I'm driving at is, we mustn't see politics as something very narrow and confined to what has gone before. The only movements that have succeeded in history are movements that were creative. And you find new ways and new forms and new arguments. Otherwise, with time, the old ways of doing things and the old ideas no longer find resonance in the marketplace of ideas. Now look at today's situation. Young people, their concerns are totally different. They're not coming out of that milieu of the 60s. They're not seeing around them inspirational movements, revolutionary and other, which they could relate to and which could inspire them. So where are they going to go? If you simply give them the cut and dried formulae that the left is so fond of, lakir ke fakir, I don't think there's an audience amongst the young for that. If you want to approach the young, you have to approach them on their ground and their terms and on the basis of their interests. If you can manage that, if you can click somewhere with that with them, maybe you've got something.